But philosophy can sound obscure and even mysterious to beginners. So, what exactly is it? How would you describe or define philosophy? Or simply, what comes to mind when you think of philosophy? Many folks were introduced to philosophy for the first time through the popular TV show, The Good Place.
Yeah, I'm listening. Are we sure we should be paying attention to these guys? It's like who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Plato.
And I actually totally encourage you to watch The Good Place if you have Netflix. Some of the themes in that show actually show up in our course sections. Now, there's also no neutral definition of what philosophy is. And in the very process of trying to define what philosophy is, of trying to clarify its nature, we find ourselves already having to philosophize simply in order to settle on the meaning of what philosophy is. And besides, different philosophers will often have competing ideas about what the ultimate matters of philosophy are about. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek concept philosophia. Philo is one of the Greek words for love, and Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom or knowledge. Philosophy, therefore, is the love of wisdom. Now, the etymology of the word philosophy is really interesting, but maybe not the most helpful. So I want us to review 3 popular definitions or ideas of philosophy. The first popular idea or conception of philosophy is that it's the quest for truth regarding ultimate matters. A second popular idea is that philosophy is theorizing on how best to live a human life. And a third popular conception of philosophy is that it's that class that's encountered as the sort of mindfuck class you take in college, right, as a freshman or a sophomore. Okay, let's think on this first conception of philosophy, the quest for truth regarding ultimate matters. And what sort of questions do philosophers ask when they address the, quote, ultimate matters? Well, sometimes first and foremost, what comes up is the question, does God exist? And can we ever know for certain one way or the other? If God does exist, right, what's the nature of God? Is it a being with a personality and characteristics? If so, what are those characteristics? And does religious faith provide reliable knowledge to these sorts of questions? We must also recognize that believers across many different religious traditions don't believe in God because of philosophical or theological arguments. And rarely is someone persuaded not to believe in God because of philosophical arguments. And this is because for many people, their belief in God's existence, their faith, is confirmed through experiences. People experience God's presence through prayer, through worship, when they're being comforted, and in a dozen other ways. But the idea of faith-confirming religious experiences raise other, thornier problems to consider. So, for example, how do we explain the fact that these faith-confirming religious experiences are had across wildly different religions? For instance, both Muslims and Hindus feel the presence of God, or believe they do, when they worship and pray, right? And the same goes for Jews and Catholics and Christians and so on, right? So how do we make sense of this? Is God actually revealing himself or herself in very personal, intimate ways to worshipers of very different religions, thereby confirming the truth of a religion that is radically different from your own? Now, many religious people, especially those who believe in heaven and hell, do not want to accept this, believing instead that their religion is the only true religion and the only path to salvation. So, if you don't accept that God is revealing themselves equally to all religions, then you're left to believe something that has its own sort of frightening implications, namely, that worshipers in different religions must be having false or imagined religious experiences when they feel God during their worship. Perhaps because they've been wrongly indoctrinated, you might think. Drawing this conclusion, however, opens the door to a very serious spiritual and sort of existential dilemma, right? Because if it's possible for these other worshipers to be so thoroughly deluded such that they are convinced that they are actually feeling God through worship, then how do you know that you're not falsely imagining or inventing God's presence when you worship and pray? Another basic question that we would consider one of the ultimate matters of philosophy is, why does something exist instead of nothing? Right? Can being come from non-being? Or has something whose essence is to exist simply always existed, like God or energy or some sort of primordial universal consciousness? Right? What is reality made of? And what is beyond the filter of human perception? Does sense experience provide us with a reliable description of reality? So, for example, is the table smooth and flat, or is it coarse and bumpy? Now, the table certainly appears to be smooth, but what if you were like Ant-Man and you could shrink down to the size of a bacteria? Would the table still appear to you as flat and smooth then? No, it would be bumpy, right? It would be like a cavern if you could shrink down and look at the otherwise smooth table, right? So what's the real table like? Is it smooth or is it bumpy? Or should we just stop talking about real tables altogether, right? So how ought we discuss the nature of reality, keeping in mind this distinction between how reality appears to us and how it actually exists in itself? And is there anything at all that we can know with absolute certainty beyond any possible doubt? Or is all knowledge ultimately dubious? For example, how can we truly know that we're not dreaming? And even if you don't believe that we are dreaming, how could we possibly demonstrate that we're not plugged into a virtual reality program, a brain in a vat, experiencing a simulation that we were born into, like Neo in the film The Matrix? And what about the spirit or the soul, right? What are they? Do we have them? Or are we just sacks of meat with no spiritual element being piloted by a physical brain? But if we do have souls or spirits, do our souls outlive the death of our bodies? Do human beings have free will, or is free will simply an illusion? Perhaps every action and choice that we've ever made was simply a physical process determined by natural laws. For example, if physical matter, or if the behavior of physical matter down to the level of atoms is governed by the laws of physics, and if human beings are made up entirely of physical matter, then are all of our actions simply determined by those physical laws, making our experience of free will just an illusion? Right, and what about morality? Why should we behave ethically or morally at all? Is morality absolute and universal, or is moral truth relative to time and place? For example, discarding a deformed or weak infant was the moral common sense in ancient Greece and in many other cultures besides. Perhaps that custom was morally right relative to their culture and morally wrong relative to our culture. Or could there be objective moral truth that transcends particular cultural norms? And how do we know if our moral compass itself is simply the product of our culture? So if a time traveler adopted you as a baby and then dropped you off in Sparta in 5th century BC, you would likely accept that it's a very good thing to kill sick and weakly newborns. Perhaps this is how you honor the god of Sparta. Perhaps this is how you promote strength and beauty in the bloodline. All right, what's the best form of society? Should it be driven primarily by cooperation among individuals or competition between them? And what sort of laws should exist? What traditions and institutions and values should be encouraged and promoted in a good society? What is a state? And what is a government? Are they necessary? Have states and governments always been around? And when may a state or a government be legitimately overthrown, if ever? For example, did the United States government or any other really derive its legitimate governing authority from the consent of the governed, as argued in the tradition of American democracy? I mean, did you or I really ever consent to anything? Now, I certainly haven't. In fact, I actively don't consent to many of the most fundamental political and economic arrangements in the country. So what exactly is even meant by this idea of the, quote, consent of the governed? Is it just a noble myth, a necessary lie that we told ourselves and each other over and over until we forgot that it was a lie? What's the appropriate response to death and dying? Right? Should we fear death? Is death a bad thing? Is death possibly somehow a good thing? And what attitude should we take up to death, both our own inevitable death and the death of our friends and our family? So these are a few of the ultimate matters that philosophers investigate and interrogate and ask. Now, many students new to philosophy wonder why it's relevant to study the abstract philosophical theories of people who are long dead. But the study of philosophy is relevant, right? And here's why. The world that we live in, the economic, scientific, legal, political, and religious institutions that have organized our world, is itself the product of the ideas of philosophers and thinkers scattered throughout history. In other words, the very world that you and I inhabit has an intellectual history. The ideas that are used to justify the organization of our world emerged from this intellectual history. So we can't hope to understand how our world works, where it's headed, much less how to change it, if we remain ignorant of how this world came to be arranged. And it's arranged on the basis of philosophical ideas. Right? It's hard to imagine anything more relevant than that. Furthermore, by demanding that you confront the fundamental questions facing human beings, philosophy helps you live a more fully human life. All right, but what is that supposed to mean? Well, learning to think philosophically enhances your self-knowledge and unique individuality. And by exploring philosophical ideas and questions, active students learn how to develop or dismantle their interests, their desires, their convictions, and even their identity. In this sense, philosophy leads to profound intellectual and perhaps even spiritual growth. Philosophy leads to self-discovery, therefore, and an expansion of consciousness. And on top of all this, philosophy can be thoroughly enjoyable, adding special pleasures of insight to many experiences, especially your conversations and your experience of music, literature, art, and film.